Alpha King Evo Sunder broke the sacred mate bond on the same night his father died, in a ritual so old that even the priests performing it seemed uncertain whether it had ever actually been done before. There was no villain forcing his hand. No forged letter, no manufactured war, no conspiracy waiting in the shadows. Just a young king, 20 years old and freshly, catastrophically alone, convinced that the moon's bond to a quiet weaver's daughter named Finmarlo made him weak in front of a court that had just watched him bury the only parent he had left. He didn't reject her the way other kings rejected their mates. No public humiliation, no cruel words before an assembled hall. He simply had the old ritual performed in private, at midnight, severing the bond with a knife and a chant and considerable ceremony, and told his council afterward that he intended to rule unattached, unencumbered, exactly the way his father always claimed the strongest kings did. Fun felt it happen from 2 miles away, in the small cottage where she'd been waiting, hopeful and uncertain, for word of whether the young king grieving his father might still want her once the funeral rites concluded. She felt something in her chest simply stop, not break. Stop, the way a heartbeat stops, quiet and absolute. She left Sunder territory before dawn, understanding without needing anyone to explain it that whatever bond had connected them no longer existed in any form she could survive staying near. Evo told himself, for the following 6 years, that the ritual had worked exactly as intended. It hadn't. The old priests who performed the severance ritual that night had made one small, catastrophic omission from the ancient texts, a single verse, easy to overlook in a ceremony nobody living had actually witnessed performed before. The bond hadn't been severed at all. It had simply gone to sleep, waiting for the one condition the old text specified would wake it again, the two have standing, once more, close enough to touch. Sunder territory had never put much faith in fate. That was, historically, considered rather unusual for a Lycan kingdom. Most territories built entire religious traditions around the moon's chosen bonds, treated the mate connection as something close to sacred, unquestionable, permanent. King Aldous Sunder, Evo's father, believed differently. He'd built his reign on the philosophy that strength came from independence, that a king tied too closely to any one person, mate, advisor, friend, became vulnerable in ways a truly powerful ruler couldn't afford. He'd never bonded himself, choosing his queen through careful political calculation instead, and he'd raised Evo to believe the same cold arithmetic represented genuine wisdom rather than simple, well-armored loneliness. Evo found Finmarlo 2 years before his father's death, in circumstances neither of them had planned or particularly wanted. A chance encounter at a border market, the bond snapping into place with the unmistakable certainty every old story described, whether Evo's father's philosophy left room for it or not. He'd loved her, in the 2 years that followed, more completely and more privately than he'd ever loved anything, a secret kept carefully from his father's court, because some part of him had always understood, without needing to be told directly, exactly what his father would think of a crown prince tethered to a common weaver's daughter through nothing but the moon's inconvenient sentiment. King Aldous died suddenly, a fever that took him within a single terrible week, and Evo, 20 years old, freshly orphaned, and utterly unmoored from the only guiding philosophy he'd ever known, made a choice in the immediate, devastating aftermath that he would spend the next 6 years telling himself was necessary, wise, exactly what his father would have wanted. He severed the bond. Not out of cruelty toward Finn specifically, but out of a desperate, grief-stricken need to become, immediately and completely, the kind of unshakable, unattached king his father had always insisted was the only kind capable of surviving what came next. The old priests who performed the ritual that night worked from a text nobody in 6 generations had actually needed to use, the severance ceremony existing mostly as theoretical ancient law rather than living practice. They missed a verse. A small one, easily overlooked, specifying that true fated bonds, the rare, complete kind, rather than the more common partial matches most Lycans experienced, couldn't actually be severed through ritual alone. They could only be paused, suspended, sent, in the old text's poetic language, to sleep beneath the same moon that woke them until fate itself decided the sleeping was done. Nobody noticed the omission. Not the priests, not Evo, not even Fun, who felt the bond's sudden silence and assumed, reasonably, that silence meant ending. It took 6 years, and a chance encounter neither of them arranged, for either of them to learn otherwise. Evo had not slept in 4 days by the time the priests arrived at his private chambers, carrying the old scrolls and ceremonial blade the severance ritual required. Grief did strange things to time. He remembered his father's funeral only in fragments, the cold weight of the crown being formally transferred, the particular silence of a hall full of people who didn't know what to say to a king barely old enough to legally drink, the way his own hands had shaken holding the ceremonial torch that lit his father's pyre. He remembered, with far more clarity, the conversation with his council 2 days later. "Your father built this kingdom's strength on independence," Lord Vasher, his father's oldest advisor, had said, careful and measured in the way old men spoke to young kings they weren't yet certain would listen. A bonded king, particularly one bonded to someone outside noble standing, invites certain kinds of court instability. Your father never permitted himself that vulnerability. I'd counsel you to consider carefully whether you can genuinely afford to, either, especially now, with the succession only just settled and half the border territories watching for any sign of weakness. Evo had wanted to argue. Some part of him, the part that still remembered, achingly, exactly what Finn's laugh sounded like, exactly how her hands felt woven through his own, had wanted to tell Vasher that his father's philosophy had also made him a man who died without anyone beside his bed who loved him for anything beyond his crown. He didn't argue. Grief had hollowed him out too thoroughly for that particular fight, and some quieter, more devastating part of him had already begun to wonder whether his father had been right all along, whether loving Finn had simply been a young man's indulgence, a weakness he could no longer justify now that an entire kingdom's stability apparently rested on his shoulders alone. The priests performed the ritual at midnight, in a private chamber lit only by candles, reading from a text so old its pages had been carefully preserved behind glass for generations, and used, mostly ceremonial, a severance ritual nobody, living, had actually needed to perform. Evo felt the bond go silent partway through the chanting, not painful, exactly, just absent, suddenly, the way a sound stops when you finally notice the silence underneath it. "It is done, Your Majesty," the eldest priest said, closing the ancient text with careful, reverent hands. "The bond is severed. You are unattached, as your father was." Evo nodded, said nothing, and went to bed that night believing, with the particular hollow certainty of someone too exhausted by grief to question anything further, that he had just done exactly what his father would have wanted. 2 miles away, in a small cottage at the edge of Sunder territory, Finn Marlowe woke from an uneasy sleep with her hand pressed to her chest, gasping at a silence where warmth used to be, and understood, without anyone needing to explain it to her, that whatever she'd shared with Evo Sunder no longer existed in any form she recognized. She packed a single bag before dawn. Finn didn't return to her family's cottage after leaving Sunder territory. She traveled instead toward the coastal town of Marrow's End, 3 weeks' journey south, chosen mostly because it was far enough away that nobody there would recognize her, and close enough to the sea that she'd always privately imagined, as a girl, that it might be a good place to disappear into a life nobody else had already decided the shape of. She found work quickly. The town's weaving guild always needed skilled hands, and Funs had been trained since childhood, careful and precise in ways that made the transition considerably easier than the rest of her life felt in those first months. She didn't talk about Sunder territory. Didn't talk about kings or bonds, or the particular hollow ache of feeling something essential simply vanish overnight. The guild women she worked alongside knew only that she'd come from somewhere north, alone, with a quiet sadness she clearly didn't want examined too closely, and they extended her the particular, practical kindness of people who understood not everyone's grief needed a story attached to it. 6 years passed this way, quiet, ordinary, gradually less painful in the way that time, even when it doesn't heal anything completely, at least wears the sharpest edges down to something survivable. She built a genuinely good life in Marrow's End, became senior enough in the Weaving Guild to train apprentices of her own, made friends who knew nothing of her past and loved her anyway for exactly who she'd become rather than who she'd once, briefly, almost been. She didn't fall in love again. Not for lack of opportunity. Marrow's End had its share of kind, decent men who noticed her over the years, and a few of them had even asked. She simply found, each time, that something in her chest remained quietly, permanently unavailable, a door that had been closed so completely 6 years earlier that she'd never quite managed to convince herself it might reopen for anyone else. She told herself this was simply grief, worn into permanent shape. She never once considered, because why would she, when everything about that terrible night had told her the bond was ended, that the closed door in her chest wasn't grief at all? It was a lock, waiting patiently for the one key that could ever open it again. Evo, 6 years and 200 miles away, built a very different kind of life around that same silence, Sunder territory prospering under his rule, exactly the unattached, unshakable king his father had always insisted the crown required. He married no one, bonded no one, threw himself instead into governance with a focus that his council praised as exactly the discipline the kingdom needed, and that Evo himself, in his rare quiet moments, understood as something closer to careful, deliberate avoidance. He didn't let himself think about Finn often. When he did, late at night, mostly, in the particular quiet hours when a busy day's distractions finally ran out, he told himself the same careful story he'd told himself for 6 years, that severing the bond had been necessary, that whatever he'd felt for her had simply been young love, intense but ultimately ordinary, the kind that fades regardless of ritual once enough time and distance accumulate. He had no reason to doubt that story. Nothing had ever happened to contradict it, until the trade summit at Marrow's End. Sunder territory's growing prosperity, 6 years into Evo's careful, disciplined reign, had created considerable interest in expanding trade with the coastal territories, a diplomatic initiative that eventually brought Evo himself, alongside a modest delegation, to the port town of Marrow's End for a week of formal negotiations neither he nor anyone in his party expected to prove particularly memorable. He noticed the Weaving Guild's exceptional work almost immediately, bolt after bolt of fabric displayed throughout the negotiation hall, considerably finer than anything Sunder's own textile trade produced, exactly the kind of quality that made expanding this particular trade relationship genuinely worth his personal attention rather than simply a delegate's routine business. "Your guild's work is remarkable," he told the hall's coordinator, a woman named Isla who'd organized the formal textile presentation with obvious pride. "I'd like to meet the artisans responsible for the finest pieces, if that's possible to arrange." "Of course, Your Majesty. Our senior weaver oversaw most of what you're admiring. She's finishing a final piece in the back workshop. I can bring her out if you'd like a moment." Evo agreed, distracted, still examining a particularly intricate tapestry, and didn't look up immediately when he heard footsteps approaching from the workshop behind him. Then something in his chest woke up. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't a slow recognition building toward realization. It was immediate, overwhelming, physical, a warmth flooding through his ribs so suddenly he actually staggered, one hand catching the edge of the display table for balance, breath punched entirely out of him. He turned, and Finmarlow stood 3 feet away, a bolt of pale blue fabric still draped over one arm, her expression shifting from polite professional composure into something considerably more devastated, as the exact same overwhelming sensation clearly, visibly struck her at precisely the same moment. The fabric slipped from her arm entirely. "That's not possible," she said, voice barely above a whisper. One hand pressed flat against her own chest like she was checking to confirm what she was feeling was real. It was severed.
6 years ago.
I felt it stop. So did I, Ivo said, equally stunned, equally breathless. I watched the priests perform the ritual myself. They stood there, 3 feet apart in a hall full of curious, confused onlookers who had no context for whatever was so visibly, overwhelmingly unfolding between the visiting king and the guild's senior weaver, both of them staring at each other with an expression that mixed 6 years of careful denial against something neither of them had any framework for understanding. "I need," Finn said finally, her voice shaking, "to sit down." Ivo caught her elbow before she could fully sway, the touch sending a fresh, overwhelming wave of sensation through both of them. Warmth, recognition, 6 years of silence collapsing all at once into something that felt, impossibly, exactly like coming home. "I think," he said, equally unsteady, "we both do." They found a quiet room away from the negotiation hall's curious onlookers, Isla ushering them both into a small side chamber with the particular tact of someone who understood, even without full context, that whatever had just happened required privacy considerably more than continued observation. "I don't understand," Finn said, once the door was closed, both of them sitting across a small table with the careful, uncertain distance of people who'd once known each other completely and now had 6 years of silence to somehow navigate around. "I felt it end. That night. I woke up, and something was simply gone. I ordered it ended," Ivo said, the admission costing him considerably more than he expected, 6 years of careful justification suddenly feeling thin and insufficient in front of the person it had actually cost. "My father had just died. His counsel convinced me, or maybe I convinced myself, using their arguments as cover, that a king couldn't afford to be tied to anyone. I had the priests perform a severance ritual. I believed it worked." Fun absorbed this with visible, complicated grief. "You chose to end it." "I did," Ivo said, not softening the admission, understanding she deserved the full weight of it rather than any careful hedging. "I was 20 years old, freshly orphaned, and terrified of becoming the kind of king my father always insisted weakness like that would produce. I made a choice I've spent 6 years telling myself was necessary. I don't think, sitting here now, I actually believe that anymore." "Then why does it still exist?"
Finn asked.
"If you severed it deliberately, why did I just feel it wake up like nothing had ever happened at all?" Neither of them had an answer. It took summoning Sunder's own eldest remaining priest, traveling urgently from Sunder territory over the following week, before genuine explanation finally arrived. "I fear," the old priest admitted, poring carefully over the same ancient text used 6 years earlier, "that we made an error in the original ritual. There is a verse here, easily overlooked given how rarely this ceremony has ever needed performing, that specifies certain bonds, true fated bonds, rather than the more common partial matches, cannot actually be severed through ritual. Only suspended." "Suspended," Ivo repeated slowly. "The text describes it as sleep," the priest said. "The bond doesn't end. It simply goes quiet until the two halves stand close enough, once again, for fate to reassert what ritual alone could never actually undo." Finn sat with this revelation, old grief and fresh, overwhelming confusion tangling together into something she didn't yet have words for. So none of it was ever actually gone. "I spent 6 years believing I'd lost something completely, and it was simply waiting." I'm sorry, Ivo said quietly. For the ritual. For 6 years of silence that never needed to happen if the priests had simply read the text correctly the first time. For choosing fear over what I actually felt when my father died and I was too young and too grieving to trust my own judgment over his counsels. I don't know what to do with that apology, Finn admitted honestly. 6 years is a long time, Ivo. I built an entire life without you in it. I'm not certain either of us is still the same person who felt that bond snap into place at a border market all those years ago. I don't expect you to simply forgive 6 years in a single conversation, Ivo said. I don't even know if forgiveness is what either of us actually needs right now beyond simply understanding what's true. I just know that whatever this bond represents, it clearly never actually left. And I'd like the chance to understand what that means for both of us, rather than making another rushed decision the way I did the last time grief and uncertainty pushed me toward one. Ivo extended his delegation's stay in Marrow's End by 2 weeks, officially to continue trade negotiations, unofficially because neither he nor Finn felt remotely ready to simply part ways again with this revelation sitting unresolved between them. He learned, over those 2 weeks, exactly how thoroughly Fun had rebuilt her entire life without him, the Weaving Guild's respect for her craft, the genuine friendships she'd built among the guild women, a quiet, self-sufficient independence that 6 years of careful, deliberate rebuilding had earned her. I'm not the same person I was at 20, she told him one evening, both of them sitting on a low wall overlooking Marrow's End's harbor, watching fishing boats return with the day's catch. I don't need rescuing, Ivo. I built a good life here, entirely on my own. Whatever this bond means, I need you to understand that clearly before either of us decides anything. I understand, Ivo said. I don't think I'm here to rescue you from anything. I think I'm here because I finally understand, after 6 years of carefully avoiding the question, that severing this bond never actually made me stronger. It just made me lonelier in a way I convinced myself was discipline. That's a difficult thing to admit, Finn observed. It's a difficult thing to have been wrong about for 6 years, Ivo said. My father built his entire philosophy on the idea that connection makes a king vulnerable. I spent 6 years ruling exactly the way he taught me to, and I built a stable kingdom, certainly. But I don't think I actually built a good life, Finn. Not the way you clearly have. She studied him carefully, old, hurt, and cautious, growing curiosity tangled together in her expression. What do you actually want from all this? Beyond simply understanding what happened. Ivo considered the question with more care than he'd allowed himself throughout 6 years of careful, deliberate avoidance. I want the chance to know who you've become, he said finally, without assuming that 6 years apart means we're simply owed an automatic return to who we were before. I want to understand whether whatever this bond is trying to tell us is something either of us actually wants to build toward, or whether it's simply an old connection that doesn't necessarily need reviving just because fate never let it fully die. That's a considerably more honest answer than I expected, Finn admitted. I've had 6 years of dishonesty with myself, Ivo said. I'd like to try something different this time, whatever it ultimately leads to. They spent the following 2 weeks in careful, deliberate conversation, not rushing toward any grand reconciliation, but genuinely, patiently getting to know exactly who each of them had become throughout 6 years of separate, independently built lives. Finn told him about the Weaving Guild's slow, satisfying craft, about the friends who'd become something like family, about the particular peace she'd found living somewhere the sea reminded her, daily, that some things kept moving regardless of grief. Ivo told her about 6 years of careful, disciplined rule that had prospered his kingdom while quietly hollowing out everything else, the friendships he'd never allowed himself to fully develop, the constant, low-grade loneliness he'd mistaken for appropriate royal discipline, the father's philosophy he'd only recently begun genuinely questioning rather than simply inheriting without examination. I think, Finn said, near the end of those 2 weeks, both of them walking along the harbor at dusk, I understand now why the bond never actually ended. Some part of me, this whole time, was always waiting. I just didn't let myself admit that, because admitting it meant admitting how much 6 years of silence actually cost me. What are you saying? Evo asked carefully. I'm saying, Finn said, that I'm not ready to simply return to Sunder territory and become whoever you need me to be, as though 6 years didn't happen. But I am willing to find out, slowly and honestly, whether there's something worth building between the person I've become and the king you're apparently trying to become now, instead of the one your father raised you to be. Evo returned to Sunder territory alone. The trade delegation's business genuinely concluded, but carried with him a considerably more complicated understanding of his own life than he'd arrived at Marrow's end with. He didn't ask Finn to abandon the life she'd built. He understood, with hard-won clarity, that doing so would simply repeat the same fundamental mistake that had originally severed their bond, making decisions about her life without genuinely accounting for what she'd actually chosen for herself. Instead, he wrote to her, regularly, honestly, without the careful political performance that governed most of his correspondence, letters about the small, ordinary frustrations of ruling a kingdom, about the particular loneliness he was only now beginning to properly examine, about questions he'd never let himself ask his father's advisors 6 years earlier, when their careful arguments had convinced him bonds were simply vulnerabilities to be managed. Finn wrote back, gradually, cautiously, her own letters carrying the particular guardedness of someone still working out exactly how much trust this renewed connection actually deserved. I keep thinking about something you said, she wrote, for months into their careful, long-distance correspondence, about your father's philosophy making you lonelier rather than stronger. I think I understand that better than I expected to. I built a genuinely good life here, Evo. But some part of me has been quietly lonely too, in a way I told myself was simply independence, rather than admitting it might be the same closed door you're describing in yourself. Evo read that letter more times than he'd admit to anyone, understanding, with growing clarity, that whatever they were slowly rebuilding required considerably more patience than either of them had initially anticipated when the bond first overwhelmingly reasserted itself in that crowded negotiation hall. He visited Marrow's End again, 6 months after the original trade summit, this time without any diplomatic pretense, simply a king traveling privately to see the woman whose bond had never actually left him, however thoroughly 6 years of careful denial had once convinced him otherwise. You came back, Finn said, meeting him at the town's edge with an expression that mixed genuine warmth with careful, continued caution. I told you I would, Evo said. I meant it. They spent that visit and several more that followed over the following year, gradually rebuilding something considerably more deliberate and honest than the intense, immediate bond that had originally connected them at 20 years old, this time built through genuine, patient choice rather than simply the moon's undeniable, overwhelming pull. I've been thinking about Sunder territory, Finn told him, nearly a year into their careful, renewed courtship, both of them sitting together on the same harbor wall where their first honest conversation had taken place, about whether I could genuinely build a life there, alongside the one I've already built here. What are you thinking? Evo asked carefully, understanding, from 6 years of hard-won lessons, exactly how important it remained not to push this particular decision. I'm thinking, Finn said, that Sunder territory could use a proper weaving guild of its own. One I could establish and lead myself, rather than simply arriving as your bonded mate with no genuine purpose beyond the title. She glanced at him, something warmer entering her careful expression. I'm thinking I'd like to try building a life there, Evo. Not instead of what I've built here, but alongside it. On my own terms this time. I would want nothing less, Evo said, genuine relief and growing happiness evident in his voice. Whatever pace, whatever terms, I understand now, more thoroughly than my 20-year-old self ever managed, exactly what genuine partnership actually requires. Finn relocated to Sunder territory gradually, over the following year, maintaining her connection to Marrow's End's weaving guild while establishing a new one within Sunder's capital. Careful, deliberate work that let her build genuine purpose alongside whatever renewed relationship continued developing with Evo. Sunder's council, initially uncertain about their king's unexpected reconciliation with a bond he'd formally severed 6 years earlier, gradually came around as Fun's genuine competence and quiet dignity earned the same respect throughout Sunder's court that she'd once earned in Marrow's End. I confess, Lord Vasher admitted, nearly 18 months into Fun's gradual integration into Sunder's court, I once counseled you toward exactly the independence that severed this bond in the first place. Watching you these past months, Your Majesty, I find myself reconsidering whether my original counsel actually served this kingdom's genuine interests, or simply reflected my own outdated assumptions about what strength requires. I don't hold you responsible for that counsel, Evo said. I made the final choice, Vasher. I understand now that choice reflected my own grief and inexperience considerably more than any genuine wisdom about what kingship actually requires. Their formal bonding ceremony, not a simple reperformance of the original ritual, but something Fun had specifically requested be entirely new, built around their own choices rather than the ancient text's traditional language, took place a full 2 years after that overwhelming reunion in Marrow's End's negotiation hall. I don't want the old words, Finn had told him, months earlier, discussing the ceremony's shape. The old ritual assumed the bond alone was sufficient, that fate deciding for us was enough, without either of us needing to actually choose. I want new words, ones that reflect what we actually built these past 2 years, rather than simply what the moon decided for us all those years ago. The ceremony that resulted, held in Sunder Territory's own version of the harbor wall where their first honest conversation had unfolded, a quiet garden overlooking the kingdom's central river, carried considerably more weight than the original ritual's ancient, formal language ever could have provided. The moon chose us once, Evo said during his vows, and I broke that choosing, believing strength required standing alone. I understand now that the moon's bond was never actually the thing worth protecting. You are. And I choose you now, deliberately, with considerably more wisdom than my 20-year-old grief ever allowed me to access, not because fate demands it, but because 2 years of rebuilding this connection, patiently and honestly, has taught me exactly what I nearly lost through cowardice dressed up as discipline. I felt that bond die once, Finn said in turn, and I built an entire life believing it gone forever. I don't regret that life, Evo. It made me who I am. But I choose, now, to bring that person, considerably stronger and more certain than the girl who once loved you at 20, into a partnership built on genuine choice, rather than simply the moon's original, undeniable pull. Whatever fate intended, 6 years ago, this time we're the ones deciding what it means. The kiss that sealed their renewed bond drew genuine, overwhelming celebration from the small gathered crowd, Sunder's council, Fun's guild colleagues who'd traveled from Marrow's End specifically to witness this, and beneath it all, a bond that had waited patiently through 6 years of silence, finally, genuinely awake on both their own terms. 3 years after that overwhelming reunion in Marrow's End, Sunder Territory had become a kingdom considerably different from the carefully disciplined, deliberately unattached rule that had once characterized Evo's original 6 years on the throne. Fun's Weaving Guild had grown into one of Sunder's most respected institutions, her own careful, patient leadership style, built on genuine collaboration rather than simple hierarchical command, gradually influencing Evo's own approach to governance in ways neither of them had fully anticipated when their renewed partnership first began. "You've changed how this council operates," Vasher observed, during a formal session marking the third anniversary of their reunion, genuine approval evident in his careful assessment. "Considerably more collaborative than your father's era, or even your own early reign. I find myself, somewhat to my own surprise, genuinely impressed by the difference." "I learned it from watching Finn run her guild," Evo admitted. "Genuine partnership produces considerably better outcomes than simple, unquestioned authority ever managed to achieve, whatever my father's philosophy once insisted." On the third anniversary of their formal bonding ceremony, Evo and Finn walked together through the same garden where their new vows had been spoken, the Sunder River catching evening light in warm, golden ripples beside them. "Any regrets?" Finn asked, a question that had, over 3 years, become something of a quiet tradition between them. "Only the 6 years I spent believing my father's philosophy over my own genuine feelings," Evo said. "But I've learned to hold that regret alongside genuine gratitude for what we've built since. Not despite that lost time, but somehow because of everything we both learned, building separate lives, before choosing to bring them together deliberately rather than simply falling back into old patterns." "I think," Finn said, "that's precisely what the old texts meant, describing the bond as sleeping rather than ending. Fate doesn't actually decide everything for us, Evo. It simply keeps the door open. What we build once we choose to walk back through it, that part was always ours to determine." Above them, the moon rose full and steady over a kingdom that had learned, through considerable hard-won difficulty, exactly what genuine strength actually required. Not careful, deliberate isolation, but the courage to choose connection honestly, even after grief and fear had once convinced a young king that severing it represented wisdom. Evo Sunder had broken a sacred bond, believing strength demanded solitude. He'd spent 6 years discovering exactly how wrong that belief had been, and considerably longer than that learning what genuine partnership, freely and repeatedly chosen, actually required: patience, honesty, and the willingness to let two independently built lives grow together, rather than simply assuming an old bond alone was ever going to be enough. The end.